He came home 2 days early and saw his grandmother pressed down in her own kitchen, her frail hands shaking against the counter, while the caregiver whispered something that made his stomach turn. No one ever expects to see cruelty in a place that still smells like old coffee, lemon cleaner, and the cinnamon rolls an elderly woman learned to bake 50 years ago. And yet that was exactly where it happened. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. How many times have you told yourself, "She's fine, she has help, someone is taking care of her"? And where are you watching this from right now? What city and state? I always read those comments because stories like this are happening everywhere. Ethan Miller was 29 years old, exhausted, and always running out of time. He lived in Columbus, Ohio, working long hours as a project coordinator for a construction management firm. His calendar was always full, his phone always buzzing, and his mind constantly split between deadlines, budgets, and the quiet guilt he tried not to feel. That guilt had a name: Margaret Miller, his grandmother. Margaret was 83 years old and had lived her entire life in a small, modest house on the outskirts of Newark, Ohio, a place with creaky floors, faded floral curtains, and a porch swing that hadn't moved much since her husband died 11 years earlier. She raised 3 children in that house, worked part-time at a local diner for decades, and somehow still found time to help neighbors, babysit kids from church, and cook meals for anyone who looked like they needed one. To Ethan, she was safety. She was the person who picked him up from school when his parents were late, the one who slipped him $5 and told him not to tell anyone, the one who sat in the front pew at every school event, even when her knees hurt. So when his mother passed away unexpectedly 3 years ago, Margaret became something else in his life. She became responsibility. At first, Ethan tried. He drove out every weekend. He fixed things around the house, helped with groceries, sat with her while she watched old game shows and reruns of shows she'd already seen a dozen times. But life doesn't slow down just because someone you love is aging. Work got heavier. Bills got higher. Traffic got worse. And slowly, without a clear moment where it happened, his visits went from weekly to bi-weekly to, "I'll come next month." That was when they hired help. Her name was Linda Parker. Late 40s. Soft voice. Always smiling. She came recommended by a local agency that specialized in in-home elder care. Background checked. References verified. Affordable enough to fit into the budget Ethan and his aunt agreed on. "She's very kind," Margaret had said on the phone. "Don't you worry so much about me, sweetheart." And Ethan wanted to believe her. Didn't you hear that tone? That tone older people use when they're trying not to be a burden? So he let himself believe everything was fine. Until that Thursday afternoon. Ethan had finished a major project ahead of schedule, something that almost never happened. His boss told him to take Friday off if he wanted, and instead of announcing it, instead of calling ahead, Ethan made a decision he hadn't made in a long time. He got in his car and drove east. It was just after 4 in the afternoon when he pulled into his grandmother's driveway. Her car wasn't there, which wasn't unusual anymore. Linda sometimes drove her to appointments or the grocery store, but something felt off before he even stepped out of the car. The front door was unlocked. That alone made his chest tighten. Margaret always locked her doors, always. She grew up in a time where you double-checked, then checked again. Inside, the house was quieter than usual. No TV noise, no radio humming softly from the kitchen, just the faint sound of water running. "Grandma?" Ethan called out. No answer. He stepped further inside, his shoes sticking slightly to the old linoleum floor. And then he heard voices. Low, close, tense. That's when he saw it. Margaret was bent forward against the kitchen counter, her shoulders hunched, her head down. Linda stood behind her, one hand gripping Margaret's wrist, the other pressing her back down harder than necessary. "I told you already," Linda whispered, her voice sharp and controlled. "If you tell anyone, you'll end up in a place where nobody visits. You hear me?" Margaret's voice was barely audible. "Please, I didn't mean—" Ethan didn't remember crossing the room. He didn't remember shouting, He just remembered the sound of his own voice breaking through the space like glass. "Get your hands off her!" Linda froze, slowly turned. Her smile appeared instantly, like a switch flipped on. "Oh, Ethan," she said lightly. "You scared me. I didn't know you were coming." Margaret was shaking. Her hands trembled so badly she had to lean on the counter to stay upright. "What the hell is going on?" Ethan demanded. Linda released her grip immediately, stepping back. She almost slipped. "I was just trying to steady her." Margaret didn't look up. Ethan walked straight to his grandmother, placing a hand on her shoulder. She felt smaller than he remembered. Lighter. Fragile. "Grandma," he said softly. "Look at me." Her eyes finally met his, and in them was something that didn't belong there. Fear. But before he could say anything else, she spoke quickly. Too quickly. "It's nothing," she said. "I just got dizzy. Linda helps me. She's very good to me." That sentence felt rehearsed. Have you ever heard someone lie to protect someone who doesn't deserve it? Or maybe to protect themselves? Ethan turned back to Linda. "You can go home for today." She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then she smiled again. "Of course. I'll put it on my timesheet." As soon as the door closed behind her, the house felt different. Too quiet. Too heavy. Ethan helped his grandmother to the living room and sat her down on the couch. Only then did he notice the bruises, dark purple marks along her forearm, faded yellow ones near her elbow, some older, some newer. His throat tightened. "What happened to your arm?" Margaret instinctively pulled her sleeve down. "Oh, that? I bump into things. You know how clumsy I am now." But Ethan knew those arms. Those were the arms that kneaded dough for decades. That held babies. That wiped tears. They weren't clumsy arms. "Grandma," he said gently. "Did she hurt you?" Margaret looked away, staring at the muted television screen. "You work so hard," she said instead. "I don't want to cause trouble." That answer landed harder than any confession. Ethan stayed that night. He ordered takeout from a diner down the road, the same one Margaret used to work at. She barely touched her food. He watched her closely, noticing things he hadn't before. How slowly she moved. How she flinched when he raised his voice slightly while talking on the phone. How she kept glancing toward the hallway, as if expecting someone to come back through the door. Later, when she went to bed, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the counter where he had seen her pressed down just hours earlier. He looked around the room, really looked for the first time in years. The pill organizer on the counter was a mess. Days skipped, some compartments empty, others full. A stack of unopened mail sat near the fruit bowl. Utility bills, medical statements, a notice from the pharmacy. Why hadn't anyone told him about this? He opened the fridge. Expired milk. Half-eaten meals labeled with dates that didn't line up. Some days missing entirely. That's when the first crack in his certainty appeared. What was really happening inside this house when no one was watching? Ethan checked the calendar hanging near the phone. Appointments crossed out. Notes scribbled in shaky handwriting. One word repeated more than once. Falls. His chest tightened again. He walked down the hallway and paused outside his grandmother's bedroom. The door was slightly open. He could hear her breathing, slow, uneven. He thought about how many times she had told him, "I'm fine." How many times he had accepted that answer because it was easier. What if being fine was just her way of protecting him? He went back to the living room and sat in the dark, listening to the house settle. Every creak sounded louder. Every shadow felt heavier, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a question wouldn't let him rest. If this was what he saw when he came home early, what had he missed all the other times? Because something told him this was only the beginning. Ethan woke up on the couch just after 6 in the morning, his neck stiff and his mind already racing. For a brief second, he forgot where he was. Then he heard it. A soft sound from down the hallway. A quiet groan, followed by the faint scrape of something heavy shifting against the floor. He sat up immediately. "Grandma?" he called. No answer. He moved quickly, his bare feet cold against the wood floor, and reached her bedroom door. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, breathing hard, one hand gripping the mattress like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "I was just trying to get to the bathroom," she said before he could ask. "I didn't want to wake you." Ethan knelt in front of her. "You should always wake me." She nodded, but her eyes said something else. They said she was used to being careful, used to not asking. He helped her stand and noticed how stiff her movements were, how she favored her left side. When she was back in bed, he gently pulled the sleeve of her nightgown up again. The bruises looked worse in the morning light. "How long has this been happening?" he asked quietly. Margaret shook her head. "I'm just old, Ethan. Old bones bruise easy." That was the second time she'd avoided the question. After breakfast, which consisted of half a piece of toast and coffee she barely drank, Ethan told her he was staying a few more days. Her reaction was immediate. Too immediate. "Oh no, you don't need to do that," she said. "You have work, your life." "My life can wait," he replied. She smiled, but her hands trembled in her lap. Around 9 the phone rang. Margaret flinched. Ethan picked it up. "Hello?" Linda's voice came through, bright and casual. "Hi, just calling to confirm I'll be there at 10. Ethan glanced at his grandmother. Her shoulders tensed. "That won't be necessary," he said. "I'll be here today." There was a pause. "Oh, well, the agency requires notice." "I'll call the agency," Ethan replied. "Don't come today." Another pause, longer this time. "Is everything okay?" Linda asked. Ethan looked at the bruises again. "We're handling it." When he hung up, Margaret let out a breath she'd been holding. "You shouldn't upset her," she said softly. That sentence stayed with him all morning. What kind of caregiver needed to be appeased? Ethan spent the next few hours doing something he hadn't done in years. He paid attention. He followed his grandmother as she moved through the house, watched where she struggled, listened to what she didn't say. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. Ethan opened it to find Mrs. Kaplan from next door, a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a permanent look of concern. "I saw your car," she said. "I thought maybe you were visiting." "I am," Ethan replied. She glanced past him, lowering her voice. "Is your grandmother okay?" That question hit harder than he expected. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Kaplan hesitated. "I don't want to interfere, but I hear things, late sometimes. And she fell last month in the driveway. I helped her up. She begged me not to call anyone." Ethan felt heat rise in his chest. "Did you see the caregiver?" Mrs. Kaplan nodded slowly. "She's strict." Strict wasn't the word Ethan would have used. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove to the local pharmacy. The pharmacist recognized Margaret's name immediately. "She hasn't picked up her last refill," the woman said. "It's been over a week." "Was anyone else authorized to pick it up?" Ethan asked. The pharmacist checked the system. "Yes, a caregiver, Linda Parker." Ethan thanked her and walked out, his mind spinning. Why would Linda pick up medication and not bring it back? When he returned home, he found his grandmother asleep in her chair, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. He didn't wake her. Instead, he went to the back bedroom, the one no one used anymore, and opened the small filing cabinet. Inside were years of paperwork, medical records, old tax returns, letters from insurance companies, and near the bottom, something that didn't belong. A thin envelope labeled Care Agreement. Ethan sat on the bed and opened it. It wasn't from the agency. It was handwritten, signed by Margaret, and by Linda. It outlined hours, tasks, and something else, a loan. Ethan's hands tightened around the paper. Why would his grandmother loan money to her caregiver? Before he could think further, the front door opened. "Grandma!" a voice called out. Ethan stepped into the hallway just as his Aunt Susan walked in, purse slung over her shoulder, irritation already on her face. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I came to check on Grandma," Ethan replied. Susan sighed. "You should have called." "And missed everything?" Ethan shot back. They stood in the kitchen, voices low but tense. Susan defended the arrangement, said Linda had been helpful, said their budget was tight, said Margaret didn't want strangers. Ethan pulled out the agreement. "Did you know about this?" Susan's face drained of color. "That wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered. "What else wasn't supposed to happen?" Ethan demanded. Margaret appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. "Please," she said, "don't fight." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her. At the woman who had carried everyone else's weight for decades. "How long have you been scared in your own house?" he asked gently. Tears filled her eyes, but she still didn't answer. That was when Ethan understood something painful. Whatever the truth was, it wasn't simple. And it wasn't just about one bad caregiver. It was about silence and fear and the quiet ways people get trapped when they think no one is watching. And the worst part? He had been part of that silence, but he still didn't know how deep it went. That night, the house felt smaller. Susan stayed for dinner, but the tension sat between them like an extra person at the table. Margaret barely spoke. She moved food around on her plate, apologizing every few minutes for things that didn't need apologies. The chicken was dry. The lights were too bright. She was tired. She always seemed tired. Ethan watched every movement, every wince, every moment where his grandmother hesitated before standing, like she was calculating whether the effort was worth the risk. After dinner, Susan pulled Ethan aside into the kitchen. "You're overreacting," she whispered. "She's old. Things happen." Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You saw the bruises." Susan looked away. "She falls." "Then why is she scared of the caregiver?" he asked. Susan's jaw tightened. "You don't know that she is." Ethan lowered his voice. "She told me not to upset Linda." That landed. Susan exhaled slowly. "You don't understand how hard this has been," she said. "She refuses assisted living. She refuses help from strangers. Linda was available." "At what cost?" Ethan asked. Susan didn't answer. That night, after Susan left, Ethan locked the doors. All of them. He checked the windows. Then he sat in the armchair across from his grandmother's recliner while she watched a rerun of an old game show. "Do you trust me?" he asked suddenly. Margaret blinked, surprised. "Of course." "Then tell me the truth," he said gently, "even if you think it'll upset me." She stared at the TV for a long moment. The audience laughter echoed softly in the room. "I don't want to be a burden," she said finally. Ethan swallowed. "You're not." She shook her head. "Your mother used to say that too, right before she burned herself out taking care of everyone. That hurt, because it was true." Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Linda said, she said places are full, that if I complained I'd end up somewhere cold, somewhere no one visits." Ethan felt a slow, cold anger settle in his chest. "Has she ever hit you?" he asked. Margaret flinched. "Just a little." "She gets frustrated," she said, "and I'm slow." That was the closest thing to a confession she could manage. Ethan stood up and paced the room. "That's abuse," he said. "That's not care." Margaret reached for his hand. Her grip was weak, but urgent. "Please don't make trouble. She helps me. And I helped her too." Ethan stopped. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "She was behind on rent. She has a son. Things are hard for everyone." There it was, the silent sacrifice. Ethan knelt in front of her. "How much?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "A few thousand." From my savings. Savings Ethan thought were untouched. Why didn't you tell anyone? He asked. She smiled sadly. You all have your lives. That sentence echoed long after she went to bed. Ethan didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m. he heard it again. The sound from the hallway. A door creaking. Then a click. He stood up slowly, heart pounding. Someone was outside. Ethan moved toward the front window and peeked through the curtain. A car idled at the curb. Headlights off. A familiar silhouette stepped out. Linda. What was she doing there in the middle of the night? Ethan grabbed his phone and quietly unlocked the front door. He stepped onto the porch just as Linda approached the steps. She froze when she saw him. Oh, she said. I forgot something earlier. At 2 a.m? Ethan replied. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Your grandmother asked me to come by. Ethan shook his head. You need to leave. Linda's expression hardened. You don't understand the arrangement. Ethan stepped forward. I understand enough. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Linda scoffed softly. She needs me, she said, and you'll be gone again in a week. That wasn't a threat. It was a prediction. Ethan watched her drive away, his hands shaking. What else did she feel entitled to? The next morning, Ethan called the agency. By noon, a social worker was scheduled to visit. Margaret cried when she heard. I didn't want this, she said. I just wanted peace. Ethan held her hand. You deserve safety. When the social worker arrived, she listened carefully, took notes, asked questions Margaret struggled to answer. When she left, she said something Ethan wouldn't forget. This isn't uncommon, she said, and it rarely starts with violence. That sentence stayed with him, because if this wasn't the beginning, then what was still coming? And more importantly, who else had been complicit without meaning to be? Ethan looked around the house again. The quiet rooms, the old furniture, the woman who had given everything and asked for nothing. He realized something then. This wasn't just about stopping one caregiver. It was about uncovering everything that had been allowed to grow in the dark. And he was only just starting to see it. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling. After the social worker's visit, nothing exploded right away. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic confrontations. Instead, there was paperwork, phone calls, waiting. And in that waiting, Ethan began to see just how deep the damage went. Margaret grew quieter. She jumped at every knock on the door. Every phone notification made her tense. When the phone rang, she looked at Ethan first, as if asking permission to breathe. Did I do something wrong? She asked more than once. That question cut deeper than anything Linda had done. Ethan stayed. He called his boss and told him he needed time off. Not a day, not a weekend. Time. You're sure? His boss asked. This project? My grandmother needs me, Ethan said. There was a pause. Then, surprisingly, understanding. Take care of your family. Ethan wondered how many people never said those words until it was too late. On the third day, the agency called back. They had concerns about Linda's file, complaints that hadn't been followed up on properly, a previous client who'd switched caregivers suddenly, without explanation, a missed audit. None of it had seemed urgent on its own. Together it painted a picture. That same afternoon Susan returned. She looked different, less defensive, more tired. I didn't know, she said as soon as she walked in. About the loan. About the nights. Ethan believed her. Or at least he wanted to. I should have been here more, she added. That made two of them. They sat with Margaret at the kitchen table, sunlight pouring in through the window. For the first time in days, Linda's name wasn't whispered. It was spoken out loud. Susan asked questions, gentle ones, about medications, about money, about fear. Margaret answered some, avoided others. I didn't want anyone fighting, she said. Families break over less. Ethan thought about that later. How many families broke because someone stayed quiet? That evening, Ethan decided to go through everything, every drawer, every envelope. Not to invade her privacy, but to protect it. He found bank statements showing small withdrawals that didn't match any bills, not large enough to raise alarms, just enough to stay unnoticed. He found notes Linda had written, instructions, reminders that sounded more like commands. Don't forget, you said you would. We agreed. Agreed to what? Then, in a shoebox under the bed, Ethan found something that made him sit down hard on the mattress. Letters. Dozens of them. Some were never opened, others carefully folded and refolded, the paper soft with age. They weren't from family. They were from other elderly people, church friends, neighbors, people from the senior center. Thank you notes. Notes asking for help. Notes apologizing for asking. Margaret had been helping others while barely managing herself. One letter stood out. I know you said not to tell anyone, but I don't know what else to do. She yells when no one's around. I'm scared. Please don't let them put me somewhere worse. Ethan read it twice, then a third time. Who was she? And why had Margaret kept this hidden? When he showed the letter to his grandmother, her shoulders sagged. She's worse off than me, Margaret said quietly. Her family lives out of state. I thought if I complained, no one would help either of us. Rhythm. There it was. Fear layered on fear. Ethan realized something then that made his chest ache. Margaret hadn't just been protecting herself. She had been trying to protect everyone else, too. The next knock on the door came early the following morning. 2 people stood outside. A woman from Adult Protective Services and a man in plain clothes who introduced himself as a financial investigator. Margaret's hands shook so badly Ethan had to hold her mug of tea. They were kind, calm. They spoke slowly, asked permission before sitting down. They asked about Linda, about money, about fear. Margaret hesitated, looked at Ethan, looked at Susan. Am I in trouble? She asked. The woman smiled gently. No, ma'am, you're not. That was when Margaret finally cried. Not loud, not dramatically, just quiet tears that had waited too long. She told them about the pressure, about the threats, about being told she'd be sent somewhere far if she talked, about being locked in her bedroom once for her own safety. Ethan's hands curled into fists. Locked. That detail hadn't come up before. Susan covered her mouth. The investigator asked about the loan. Margaret nodded. She said she'd pay it back. She said she needed it to keep helping me. They exchanged a look. After they left, the house felt strangely empty, but also lighter. Later that day, Linda called. Ethan answered. You had no right, Linda snapped. You've ruined everything. Ethan's voice was steady. You did that yourself. You think she'll be happier? Linda shot back. Being watched by strangers, being poked and questioned? Ethan paused. She's not scared anymore. Linda laughed bitterly. She will be. The line went dead. That night, Margaret slept through the night for the first time since Ethan arrived. No groans, no footsteps, no flinching at shadows. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the same spot as before, but it felt different now. He thought about the letter, about other elderly people suffering quietly in houses just like this one, and a question began to form in his mind. What happens after the danger is gone? Because stopping one person didn't fix a system that thrived on silence. The next morning, Ethan drove Margaret to the senior center for the first time in months. The staff greeted her warmly. Too warmly, like they'd been worried. One woman pulled Ethan aside. We tried calling her, she said. But the caregiver said she wasn't feeling well. That confirmed it. Control, isolation, lies. On the drive home, Margaret stared out the window. I used to like helping, she said softly. I didn't know when it turned into this. Ethan swallowed. You didn't do anything wrong. She smiled sadly. I should have asked for help sooner. That sentence stayed with Ethan all day. Because how many people never said it at all? By the end of the week, Linda was officially suspended pending investigation. But the relief didn't last long, because the social worker called again. "There's something else," she said. "Another case connected to Linda, an elderly man in a neighboring town." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Is he okay?" he asked. There was a pause. "He didn't have anyone like you checking in?" Ethan closed his eyes. The story was bigger now, bigger than one house, one family, and the truth was clear. What Margaret had endured wasn't rare. It was invisible. And now that Ethan had seen it, he couldn't unsee it. Because if silence had allowed this to happen once, how many times had it already happened before? And how many times would it happen again if someone didn't decide to stay and fight? Ethan didn't tell his grandmother about the other man right away. He didn't know how to. He watched her carefully that morning as she sat at the kitchen table, folding and unfolding a napkin with slow, deliberate movements. She looked calmer than she had days ago, but there was still a fragile edge to her piece, like glass that could crack if pressed too hard. Instead, Ethan called the number the social worker gave him and drove alone to a neighboring town less than 30 minutes away. A place with a quieter main street, a shuttered diner, and houses that looked too still, like they were holding their breath. The man's name was Harold Jensen, 87, widower, no children, a niece who lived 3 states away and called when she could. When Ethan arrived, the front door was locked, curtains drawn, no car in the driveway. He knocked anyway. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Just as he was about to leave, a woman opened the door across the street. "Are you looking for Mr. Jensen?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan said. "Is he okay?" She hesitated. That pause said more than any words. "They took him to the hospital last week," she said quietly. "Dehydration. A fall." He was confused. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Who took care of him? The woman shrugged. "Some caregiver. I only saw her a few times. She didn't like neighbors asking questions." Linda. The name didn't need to be spoken. Ethan drove back in silence, gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. He thought about Margaret, about how close she had come to being another quiet statistic, another case file, another neighbor shaking their head too late. When he got home, Margaret was in the living room, sitting near the window, sunlight warming her face. She looked peaceful, almost content. Ethan sat across from her and took her hand. "There's something I need to tell you," he said gently. She nodded. "I know." That surprised him. "I heard you on the phone," she said softly. "I knew there were others." Ethan swallowed. "I didn't want to scare you." She squeezed his hand. "It scares me more to think I wasn't the only one." They sat like that for a while, the weight of shared understanding filling the room. "You tried to help," Ethan said. "You didn't know." Margaret looked down at their joined hands. "I should have spoken sooner." Ethan shook his head. "You spoke when you could. And now, it matters." That afternoon, the social worker returned with updates. Linda's suspension had turned into a full investigation. Financial abuse, emotional coercion, possible physical harm. "They're taking it seriously," the woman said, "because people spoke up." Margaret listened quietly, then asked, "Will she hurt anyone else?" The social worker paused. "We're doing everything we can to prevent that." That answer wasn't perfect, but it was honest. That evening, Susan stayed late. She helped clean out the guest room, making space for a hospital bed that would arrive the next day. Physical therapy had been approved. A visiting nurse would come twice a week. The house began to change. Not all at once. Slowly. Safely. But not everything felt settled. Ethan couldn't shake the image of Harold Jensen's empty house, or the letter in the shoebox, or the way Margaret had flinched at a ringing phone. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, asking himself questions that wouldn't go away. How many caregivers operated without oversight? How many elderly people were afraid to speak? How many families told themselves everything was fine because they wanted to believe it? Around 3 in the morning, Ethan got up and walked to the kitchen. He poured a glass of water and stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street. That's when the idea began to form. It wasn't a plan yet, just a thought. What if checking in wasn't optional? What if no one had to rely on silence to survive? The next morning, Ethan called his boss again. "I'm not coming back right away," he said. There was a pause. "Is everything okay?" "No," Ethan replied honestly. "But it will be." He explained the situation, the investigation, the time commitment, the uncertainty. His boss sighed. "We'll figure it out." Ethan hung up, feeling something unfamiliar. Relief. Later that day, the senior center called. They wanted Margaret to come by for a small gathering, a lunch, nothing formal. She hesitated at first. "I don't want to be a bother." Ethan smiled gently. "You won't be." When they arrived, people greeted her like she had never left. There were hugs, soft laughter, a woman who pressed a handwritten note into her hand and whispered, "I'm glad you're back." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. On the drive home, she said quietly, "I forgot what it felt like to be seen." That sentence stayed with Ethan, because being seen had changed everything. That night, Ethan sat down with a notebook for the first time in years. Not for work, not for planning projects, for listening. He wrote down names, neighbors, church members, people at the senior center, people who lived alone, people who needed someone to check in. He didn't know where it would lead yet, but he knew one thing. He wasn't leaving again, and neither was the silence, because once you see how quietly harm can happen, you can't pretend not to hear it anymore. And Ethan was finally ready to listen. The notebook filled faster than Ethan expected. Names turned into addresses. Addresses turned into stories. A woman who hadn't driven in 3 years because her eyesight faded faster than her pride. A man who skipped meals at the end of the month to afford his prescriptions. A couple who took turns pretending not to hear the other cry at night. Margaret watched him from the doorway as he wrote. "You don't have to fix everything," she said softly. Ethan looked up. "I know." But part of him wasn't sure that was true anymore. The visiting nurse arrived the next morning, cheerful and calm, explaining every step before touching Margaret, asking permission even for small things. Ethan noticed how different his grandmother's body language was. No flinching, no tight shoulders, just cautious trust. Trust earned slowly. After the nurse left, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, staring at her hands. "I used to think needing help meant I failed," she said. Ethan sat across from her. "Who taught you that?" She smiled sadly. "Life." That afternoon the phone rang again. This time it was the investigator. "We've located additional victims," he said. "Some are willing to speak. Some aren't." Ethan closed his eyes. "What happens next?" "Charges are likely," the man replied. "But it'll take time." Time. That word felt heavier now. When Ethan told Margaret, she didn't look relieved. She looked tired. "I don't want revenge," she said. "I just don't want anyone else scared like that." That was when Ethan understood something important. Justice didn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looked like prevention. A week later, Ethan attended his first community meeting at the senior center. It wasn't anything official, just folding chairs in a circle, coffee in paper cups, people talking over one another at first, then slowly listening. He introduced himself awkwardly, explained why he was there. "My grandmother was hurt," he said simply, "and we didn't see it until it almost went too far." Heads nodded. A woman spoke up. "It happens when people stop coming around." Another added, "Or when we're afraid to complain." Someone else said, "Caregivers have power when no one checks." Ethan wrote everything down. After the meeting, a pastor approached him. "Our church has volunteers," he said. "They visit, but it's informal, maybe too informal." A retired nurse offered to help review medication routines. A social worker suggested a rotating check-in schedule. Suddenly, the notebook wasn't just notes anymore. It was a blueprint. At home, Margaret listened as Ethan talked through ideas. A phone tree, scheduled visits, a way to verify caregivers without intimidating the elderly. "You're building something," she said. He hesitated. "With you," Margaret smiled. "I'm not strong like I used to be." "You're stronger than you think," Ethan replied. She laughed softly. "That sounds like something your grandfather would say." They both went quiet at the mention of him. Later that night, Ethan found an old photo album tucked away in a drawer. Black and white photos. Margaret and her husband dancing at a church social. Her holding a newborn Ethan, exhaustion and joy mixing on her face. She had lived a full life. She deserved safety at the end of it. The following month passed in careful steps. Linda was formally charged with financial exploitation and elder abuse. The news spread quietly through court records and whispered conversations. No headlines, no cameras. Margaret didn't attend the hearings. "I don't need to see her again," she said, but she did write a statement. It took her days. When she finished, her hand cramped, but her voice was clear. "I stayed silent because I thought I was protecting my family," she wrote. "I learned too late that silence only protects harm." Ethan read it twice, his eyes burning. The community project took shape under a simple name. Just checking in. No big funding, no flashy branding, just a schedule, a promise, and accountability. Every elderly person on the list would receive at least 2 check-ins a week. Different people, different times, no patterns that could be exploited. Caregivers would know they were being seen. And more importantly, the elderly would know they weren't forgotten. Margaret insisted on being part of it. She made calls, wrote notes, sat with people who needed company more than conversation. "You don't need to fix me," she told one woman. "Just sit." Ethan watched her come alive in a way he hadn't seen in years, still frail, still slow, but purposeful. One afternoon he found her in the living room surrounded by envelopes. "What's all this?" he asked. "Thank you notes," she said, "from people who thought no one would notice them." Ethan picked one up. The handwriting shook. "I sleep better now," it read. That night, Ethan recorded a short video for the community page. No script, just honesty. "If you're watching this," he said, "and there's an older person in your life, don't assume help means safety. Presence does." The response surprised him. Messages came in from other towns, other states, people asking how to start something similar. Ethan realized then that this wasn't just a local issue, it was everywhere. Margaret's health had good days and bad days. Some mornings she moved easily, others pain slowed her down, but fear no longer lived in her house. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, she said, "I used to be afraid of being alone at the end." Ethan looked at her. "And now?" She smiled, resting her head back. "Now I'm afraid of missing things." That was a good fear. Months later, Ethan returned to work part-time. He restructured his life. Fewer late nights, more boundaries. Success looked different now. On the anniversary of his mother's death, Ethan and Margaret visited her grave together. Margaret placed flowers carefully, her hands steady. "I wish she could see this," Margaret said. Ethan nodded. "She can." They stood quietly, the weight of grief lighter than before. That night, Ethan sat with Margaret as she watched her favorite show. She fell asleep halfway through, her breathing slow and peaceful. Ethan turned off the TV and covered her with a blanket. Before leaving the room, he paused. "If you're watching this right now, let me ask you something. When was the last time you really checked on the oldest person you love? Not a text, not a quick call, but a real check. Because silence is easy, and harm hides there." Margaret slept on, safe in her home, surrounded by a world that finally saw her. And Ethan knew one thing for sure: no amount of success, no busy schedule, no excuse, was ever worth missing what mattered most. If this story touched you, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you want more stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next story might sound different, but the silence behind it will feel very familiar. The morning light came in soft through the curtains, the kind that doesn't rush you. Margaret was already awake when Ethan stepped into the living room. She sat in her chair with a blanket over her legs, a cup of coffee in both hands, watching the street like she had done for decades. Neighbors walking dogs, a school bus stopping at the corner. Ordinary life moving forward. "Did I wake you?" Ethan asked. She smiled. "I've been up a while. I like watching people start their day." There was peace in her voice now, not the forced calm she used to wear. Real peace. Ethan sat on the arm of the couch. "How do you feel?" She thought about it. "Safe," she said. "That's new." Sometimes the most powerful words are the simplest ones. Later that week, Ethan stood at the senior center, watching a small group gather around a folding table. Volunteers checked names, smiled, asked questions that mattered. Not just, "Are you okay?" but, "How are you really doing?" Margaret sat among them, listening more than she spoke. When she did speak, people leaned in. She didn't talk about abuse. She didn't talk about fear. She talked about life, about raising kids with no money and a lot of love, about losing her husband and learning how to sleep alone, about how easy it is to disappear when you stop asking for help. And how dangerous that can be, she added quietly. People nodded. Afterward, a young woman approached Ethan. "My grandfather lives alone," she said. "I thought hiring help was enough." Ethan shook his head gently. "It's a start, not the finish." That message spread faster than he expected, not through ads, not through headlines, through conversations. Weeks passed, then months. Linda took a plea deal. She lost her license. Restitution was ordered, though Ethan knew money wouldn't undo the damage. Still, it mattered. Accountability mattered. Margaret didn't attend the final hearing. She stayed home, baking muffins for the weekly check-in group. "I don't want my last memories of her to be in a courtroom," she said. Instead, she chose the kitchen. The smell of cinnamon, the sound of laughter, the house felt alive again. One afternoon, Ethan found Margaret sorting through old photographs. She held one up. "That was your first bike," she said. "You cried for an hour when you fell." Ethan laughed. "You told me to get back on." She nodded. "I always knew you would." He looked at her, really looked at her, the lines on her face, the strength still there, quieter now but unbroken. "I should have been here sooner," he said. She reached for his hand. "You're here now." That was forgiveness, simple, complete. That evening, Ethan sat alone and reflected on how close he had come to missing everything, how easy it was to assume, to delegate love, to trust systems without staying present. And if you're still watching this story, ask yourself something honestly. Who is the Margaret in your life? Who trusts you enough to stay quiet? Who might be saying, "I'm fine," because they don't want to be a burden? Don't wait for an early arrival. Don't wait for a bruise. Don't wait for a moment that can't be undone. Presence doesn't require perfection. It just requires showing up. Margaret lived out her days surrounded by people who saw her, not as a responsibility, not as a problem, but as a person who mattered. And Ethan learned what success really looks like. If this story moved you, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. And write one word for Margaret. Just one. If you want more stories like this, like and subscribe. Because the next story might be about someone else, but the choice to show up will always be yours. The porch light clicked on as dusk settled in, a soft glow spilling across the worn wooden steps. Margaret liked that light. She said it made the house feel like it was waiting for someone, even when no one was coming. Ethan sat beside her, listening to the crickets start their evening song. She rested her hands on the arms of the chair, relaxed, no longer bracing for footsteps that shouldn't be there. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think the end of life was about holding on." Ethan turned to her. "And now?" "Now I think it's about letting people hold you," she replied. He nodded, feeling that settle deep in his chest. Margaret didn't talk much after that. She didn't need to. Her presence said enough. The fear that once lived in her shoulders was gone. The house felt different, not because it had been renovated or filled with new things, but because it was honest again. Weeks later, a handwritten card arrived in the mail. It was from Harold Jensen's niece. "He's recovering," it read. "He asked me to thank the woman who spoke up. He said her courage reached farther than she knows." Ethan read the card out loud to Margaret. She closed her eyes and smiled. "I'm glad," she said. "No one should be alone like that." That night, Ethan pinned the card to the bulletin board above his desk, right next to the first page of his old notebook. A reminder of where all of this began. Not with a grand plan, but with one moment of seeing something that shouldn't have been ignored. If you're still here, still listening, let me say this clearly. Elderly people don't lose their dignity with age. They lose it when the world stops paying attention. Care isn't just a service. It's a relationship, and no contract, no agency, no busy schedule can replace presence. Margaret's story didn't end with anger. It ended with truth, with accountability, with a community that decided silence was no longer acceptable. So tonight, before you scroll to the next video, think of one person. Just one. An older parent, a grandparent, a neighbor. Check in. Show up. Because sometimes coming home early doesn't just change one life. It changes everything. If this story meant something to you, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and stay with us. There are still too many voices waiting to be heard. The following weeks forced Ethan to confront something he had avoided for years. His grandmother's past was not just a backdrop to her suffering, it was the foundation of everything she endured in silence. One afternoon, while sorting old boxes in the basement, Ethan found a small tin container wrapped in a dish towel. Inside were black and white photographs, brittle letters, and a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been opened and closed hundreds of times. Margaret watched him from the stairs. "You found my memory box," she said. Ethan sat on the bottom step. "I didn't know this was here." She smiled faintly. "Most people don't ask about old memories. They think they're heavy." Ethan opened the folded paper carefully. It was a handwritten list. Dates, dollar amounts, names. "What is this?" he asked. Margaret lowered herself onto the step beside him. "People I helped," she said, "over the years." Some of the dates went back decades. Grocery money, rent assistance, funeral costs, small amounts that added up over a lifetime. "You never told anyone," Ethan said. She shook her head. "I wasn't supposed to." "Who told you that?" he asked. "Life did," she answered simply. She told him about growing up during a time when asking for help meant being judged, about marrying young, about working double shifts after her husband injured his back, about losing friends who disappeared quietly into institutions their families rarely visited. "That's when I promised myself something," she said. "If I ever had anything extra, no matter how small, I'd help someone stay in their home." Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. "And when you needed help?" he asked. Margaret looked down at her hands. "I thought it was my turn to be quiet." That sentence explained everything. The next layer of tension arrived without warning. A certified letter came in the mail. Linda was contesting the suspension, claiming misunderstandings, claiming Margaret had exaggerated, claiming the family had overreacted. Margaret's hands shook when she read it. "She says I agreed," she whispered. Ethan sat beside her. "You were coerced." "But what if they believe her?" Margaret asked. "I don't want to go through this." This time, Ethan didn't promise it would be easy. I promise you won't go through it alone," he said. The hearing date was set. In the days leading up to it, Ethan noticed Margaret growing quieter again, old habits resurfacing, apologizing, minimizing, withdrawing. Trauma doesn't disappear just because danger leaves. One night, Ethan overheard her on the phone. "I'm fine," she said softly. "Really. You don't need to come." Ethan stepped into the room. She hung up, startled. "I didn't want to worry her," she said. "Who was that?" he asked. "A woman from church," Margaret replied. "She offered to sit with me during the hearing." Ethan nodded. "That's not worrying. That's support," Margaret sighed. "I'm not used to it." The hearing took place in a small county building. No jury, just officials, paperwork, and quiet tension. Linda sat across the room, avoiding eye contact. When Margaret was asked to speak, her voice trembled at first. Then something changed. She talked about being afraid, about being threatened with isolation, about being told no one would believe her. She talked about silence, and she talked about the moment Ethan walked in early. "I didn't scream," Margaret said, "because I was embarrassed, because I thought I failed." The room was still. "And then I realized something," she continued. "Needing help didn't make me weak. Being afraid didn't make me wrong." Linda was found responsible. The suspension stood. Additional restrictions were imposed. Margaret didn't smile, but she stood taller on the way out. Outside, she took a deep breath. "I didn't think I could do that." Ethan smiled. "You've been doing harder things your whole life." The project expanded after that. More volunteers, more calls, more check-ins. Ethan noticed something unexpected. Caregivers who were ethical welcomed the oversight. The ones who weren't, didn't. That told him everything. One evening, Margaret sat with a young volunteer, teaching her how to write reminder notes that didn't feel bossy. "Kindness sounds different when you've lived long enough," Margaret said. The volunteer nodded. "I hope I'm like you someday." Margaret smiled. "I hope you never have to be." That night, Ethan realized something crucial. This wasn't just about elder care. It was about dignity. And dignity required witnesses. If you're watching this and wondering how something like this happens, ask yourself this: how many people stop checking because they assume someone else is doing it? Margaret didn't suffer because she was alone. She suffered because everyone thought she wasn't. And that illusion almost cost her everything. The story wasn't over yet. Not for Margaret, not for Ethan, and not for the many people who were only now beginning to speak. We continue. The winter came quietly that year. Not with storms or headlines, but with small changes Ethan noticed only because he was finally paying attention. Margaret took longer to button her sweaters. Her hands stiffened in the mornings. Some days her memory drifted just enough to scare her. "I forgot where I put the kettle," she said once, laughing it off. But her eyes searched his face, looking for reassurance. "You found it," Ethan said gently. "That's what matters." Still, he started writing things down. Appointments, medication times, notes about good days and harder ones. Not out of panic, but out of respect, because pretending things weren't changing wouldn't protect her. The project kept growing. Just checking in spread to 2 neighboring towns. Nothing fancy. No website at first. Just word of mouth, church bulletins, and people telling other people, someone actually shows up. Ethan found himself sitting at kitchen tables across the county, listening to stories that sounded uncomfortably familiar. An elderly man whose caregiver controlled his phone. A woman whose son lived an hour away but hadn't visited in a year. A couple afraid to complain because we don't want to be difficult. Different faces, same silence. One afternoon, Ethan came home to find Margaret sitting very still in her chair, staring at the front door. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I thought someone was coming," she said. "I must have imagined it." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay awake thinking about something the social worker had said weeks earlier. It rarely starts with violence. What if it didn't end with it either? What if the real danger was what came after, when people assumed the problem was solved? The next day, Ethan made a decision. He called a meeting. Not just volunteers, families, adult children, grandchildren, anyone who had hired help and thought their job was done. The room was full. Ethan didn't use slides. He didn't use statistics. He told Margaret's story. Not the worst details, just the truth. "I thought help meant safety," he said. "I thought love could be delegated." People shifted in their seats. "How many of you haven't visited in the last month?" he asked quietly. Hands stayed down. No one wanted to answer. After the meeting, a man approached Ethan with tears in his eyes. "My mother says she's fine," he said. "She always says that." Ethan nodded. "Mine did too." At home that evening, Margaret asked how it went. "I think people listened," Ethan said. She smiled. "That's all you can ask for." Then she paused. "Ethan," she said softly, "if I ever stop being able to tell you things, promise me you'll still listen." His throat tightened. "I promise." The call came 2 weeks later. Margaret had fallen in the bathroom while Ethan was out picking up groceries. The volunteer who was scheduled to check in arrived early by chance. "She's okay," the nurse said over the phone. "Bruised, shaken, but okay." Ethan drove home faster than he ever had. Margaret was sitting on the couch when he arrived, wrapped in a blanket, embarrassed more than hurt. "I didn't want to make a fuss," she said. Ethan knelt in front of her, heart pounding. "You don't get to decide that alone anymore." She nodded. "I know." That fall changed something, not dramatically, quietly. Margaret accepted the walker without arguing. She agreed to a medical alert system. She let people help her shower on the days she felt unsteady, not because she had given up, because she trusted. One night, as Ethan helped her into bed, she said something he hadn't expected. "I used to think being strong meant never needing anyone," she said. "I was wrong." Ethan sat beside her. "What does it mean now?" "It means choosing who you lean on," she replied. Spring arrived. The porch swing moved again. Margaret spent more time outside, greeting neighbors, waving at kids on bikes. People stopped by more often now, not out of obligation, out of habit. Presence had become routine. Ethan noticed something else too. He wasn't angry anymore. The rage he'd carried, at Linda, at the system, at himself, had softened into something steadier. Responsibility. One afternoon, Margaret asked him to bring the memory box upstairs. "I want to go through it with you," she said. They spread the photos across the table. She told him stories he'd never heard, about mistakes she'd made, people she'd hurt unintentionally, times she wished she'd spoken up sooner. "I wasn't perfect," she said. "I just kept going." Ethan realized then that part of honoring her wasn't putting her on a pedestal, it was seeing her fully. A few months later, the local paper ran a small piece about just checking in. No names, no drama, just a mention of community members looking out for one another. Margaret read it twice. "They didn't mention me," she said, amused. Ethan smiled. "You're everywhere in it." That summer, Margaret's health declined slowly, predictably, naturally. There were more doctor visits, more tired days, fewer outings, but there was no fear. One evening, as Ethan sat with her watching the sunset, she reached for his hand. "You came home early," she said. He nodded. "That saved me," she said simply. Ethan swallowed. "I should have come sooner." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You came when it mattered. If you're still watching this, let me ask you something. How many signs do we miss because nothing feels urgent yet? How many later moments turn into regrets?" Margaret didn't need a hero. She needed someone to show up before it was too late. And Ethan finally understood that care isn't measured in hours paid or boxes checked. It's measured in presence. And presence, once chosen, changes everything. The story isn't finished yet. The story wasn't finished yet, because life didn't stop once the danger passed. What changed was the way Margaret lived inside it. The following year unfolded slowly, marked not by dramatic events, but by small, meaningful moments Ethan had once overlooked. Mornings began earlier now, not out of necessity, but habit. Margaret liked being awake before the world rushed in. She said it gave her a sense of control she hadn't felt in a long time. Some days she moved carefully, leaning on her walker. Other days she surprised Ethan by standing up on her own, determined, proud, refusing help until she truly needed it. "I'm not fragile," she reminded him once, smiling. "I'm just older." Ethan learned the difference. The project continued to grow, but Margaret's role in it shifted. She stopped making calls every day. Instead, she became the quiet presence people trusted. When someone new joined, unsure and embarrassed, it was Margaret who welcomed them. "You don't have to explain yourself," she would say. "Just sit." And they did. One afternoon, a woman in her late 70s broke down crying at the senior center, overwhelmed by guilt for needing help after a fall. Margaret listened without interrupting. When the woman finished, Margaret reached out and held her hand. "You're not failing," she said. "You're surviving." That sentence stayed with more than just that woman. Ethan noticed something else, too. Margaret had started talking about her past more openly. Not just the good memories, but the difficult ones, the mistakes, the regrets. "I wasn't always patient," she admitted once. "I wasn't always kind." Ethan shook his head. "You gave everything." She smiled gently. "Sometimes that's part of the problem." Those conversations mattered. They grounded her. They reminded Ethan that honoring her didn't mean protecting her from truth, but allowing her to be whole. As the seasons changed, so did Margaret's health. Nothing sudden, nothing alarming at first, just more fatigue, longer rests, occasional confusion that came and went. Ethan learned to sit with uncertainty without panic. He also learned when to ask for help. Hospice was mentioned quietly, gently, by a doctor who spoke with respect and patience. Margaret listened carefully. "Not yet," she said, "but thank you for being honest." That honesty mattered to her. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Margaret asked Ethan to sit beside her. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything," he replied. "When I get tired, really tired, don't rush to fix it," she said. "Just stay." Ethan swallowed. "I can do that." She nodded. "Good. I spent a long time being afraid of slowing people down." That fear no longer controlled her. The community noticed the change too, not just in Margaret, but in Ethan. He was calmer, more present. He no longer measured time by productivity alone. Success had taken on a different shape. One day, Ethan found Margaret organizing old letters again. This time, she handed one to him. "I want you to keep this," she said. It was a letter she had written years earlier, never sent. Addressed to Ethan. In it, she apologized for being too quiet when she needed help, for teaching him, unintentionally, that love meant endurance without complaint. "I didn't mean to teach you that," she had written. "I just didn't know another way." Ethan folded the letter carefully, his hand steady. "You taught me something better," he said, "even if it took time." As summer returned, Margaret spent more afternoons on the porch. Neighbors waved. Children stopped by to pet her dog. The house felt open again, no longer guarded by fear. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Margaret spoke softly. "I used to think the hardest part of getting old was losing people," she said. "Now I think it's being afraid no one will notice you're still here." Ethan sat quietly, letting that truth land. "You're noticed," he said. "Every day." She smiled. "That's why I'm not scared anymore." In her final months, Margaret's world grew smaller, but fuller. Fewer outings, more stillness, more quiet conversations that didn't need answers. Ethan stayed close. Some nights, They sat in silence. Other nights, Margaret told stories she had never shared before. About love, about choices she would make again, and some she wouldn't. "I don't regret being generous," she said once. "I regret not being honest about when it hurt." That honesty became her gift. When the end came, it wasn't dramatic. It was gentle. Margaret passed away early one morning, sunlight just beginning to touch the edges of the room. Ethan was there, holding her hand, keeping his promise. There was no fear in her face, only peace. The funeral was small, just as she wanted. People shared stories Ethan had never heard, lives Margaret had touched quietly, without recognition. "You helped my mother stay home," one man said. "You sat with my father when no one else would," said another. Ethan listened, realizing the full reach of a life lived quietly but deeply. Afterward, Ethan returned to the house alone. For a moment the silence felt heavy again. Then he remembered something Margaret once said. "Silence isn't the enemy," she told him. "Being unseen is." So Ethan didn't let her disappear. He kept the project going, expanded it carefully, thoughtfully. Always grounded in dignity, not charity. Margaret's chair stayed by the window. The porch light stayed on at night. And every time someone new joined the program, Ethan told them a simple truth. "This started because someone came home early," he said, "and decided to stay. If you're still listening to this story, remember this. Abuse doesn't always look loud. Neglect doesn't always look cruel. And love isn't proven by intention alone. It's proven by presence." Margaret taught that lesson quietly. And because someone finally listened, her story didn't end in silence.